actually, and then we can. Yeah, so when mistakes happen, there's nothing to be done about the mistake itself. That's done.
Right.
We
shouldn't beat them. You're saying?
Not the first time. So, what? Like my kids, are starting to find me predictable because they often ask me the questions: what happens if you eat? Let's say that they'll come to me with a question like this and say, "What happens if you eat cheese and after as you swallow, you suddenly remember that you had meat an hour ago?" So my standard pat response to that is that then lightning will come and strike you.
Actually, it's a good question. Do you swallow because you made the bracha, or do you spit it out? Make a long.
We dealt with that question. We dealt with that question actually in Shir, don't you recall? I think you were there. When we had this question of like it hinges on whether or not a bracha levatala is an issur d'oraisa.
Right.
Because if it's an issur d'oraisa and not eating the and not having the milk after the meat is an issur d'rabbanan, then the issur d'oraisa is worse, and therefore you should at least have a nibble of the cheese and swallow in order to avoid the issur d'oraisa. However, if the bracha is an issur d'rabbanan, then you've got a conflict between a conflict between an assay and a lota, a kumva assay and a shevel of altase. So when you have two isurim which are basically on the same level, then you have to look at it's better to violate something passively than to violate something actively. So if you must violate something, then do it the passive way rather. And that's usually sort of a fallback position in halacha when you've got a safek as to what's the right thing to do. I see. Eliezer, I think one of Eliezer's cats has destroyed his Zoom. Use your phone, Eliezer. It's time to use your phone.
Could he hear us at all, or just not even that?
I don't know. He's somewhat logged in, but anyway. So, right. So that's I mean it's a nice little segue just to talk about principles in halacha. When you've got a conflict between two things and one of them is d'oraisa and one of them is d'rabbanan, then the d'oraisa always wins. You have to make sure that you're keeping the d'oraisa din, unless it's a situation where you have a mitzvah's asay d'oraisa and a mitzvah's lot asay d'rabbanan, which comes up, for example, when you have a hello Eliezer, nice to see you. he's getting connected.
There's two Eliezers tonight.
Yeah. Hasn't got his sound connected yet, but we'll get there. So there we go. Now we've got you, and you've got. Okay, one of you is going to have to be muted. Okay, great. You logged out of the one. Okay, so for example, Chazal will often make an issur d'rabbanan that overrides an asay d'oraisa. For example, taking lulav on Shabbos or blowing shofar on Shabbos.
Right.
Okay, that's a mitzvah d'oraisa, but the Chachamim made an issur d'rabbanan to do it. So there's a clear conflict, and we follow the negative rather than we the d'rabbanan, because they specifically paskin it in that situation.
Shaul, I'll be back with you in a minute.
No worries. there are lots of other trade-offs, and this is where it's actually important to understand what's a d'oraisa and what's a d'rabbanan, and all these little subtleties and arguments between the achronim and the rishonim and whoever it is on the on any given point in halacha can make a very different approach as to how to deal with conflict situations. So here's a very common one. What happens when a man is in sort of secular company and a woman sticks out her hand to shake his hand, say, "Hi, nice to meet you." And freeze frame at this moment in time as the woman sticks her hand out. There are a couple of conflicting things. One is nagia, right? A man's not allowed to touch a woman who's not his direct family member, and that's so now he's got to say, okay, what level of isser is there to shake hands with this woman? Okay, so well, this kind of depends. If he can say, look, the isser of touching a woman is when he's touching her in a sexually suggestive way. That's for sure d'oraisa. That's an erva. That's and as a matter of fact, it can be a yaharik val yavor. You should rather give your life than do something like that because it's something that's associated with giloy arayos. Okay, but if it's just sort of a casual touch, such as as a doctor might check, a female doctor might check a male patient or whatever, this isn't something that's for pleasure. It's something that's just a very neutral and sterile sort of touch. So that's kind of what the handshake might be. And that little subtlety can, on the one end, okay, and on the other end, there's the possibility that if he refuses to shake hands, then the woman will be embarrassed. Okay, and embarrassing a person, especially if it's in a public setting, that can be an isser d'oraisa. So, and if the person has a way to finesse it so that he's confident that it's not going to be embarrassing, okay, matov manaim, and they understand, okay, and nobody has to be hurt or embarrassed, but it's very difficult for a person to tell what kind of reaction is going to be. So you're running the risk by refusing a handshake of causing an isser d'oraisa. And you're running, on the other hand, you've got the possibility that on that subtle point of, is this a neutral touch that's only an isser d'rabbanan, or is this something that could be a sensual touch, which is a yeharik val yavor? So all of this is all of these things. We froze the frame at this moment when the guy, as the woman sticks out her hand, and he instantaneously has to decide what's the shikul over here. Is he going to be able to get away with saying, "Look, I have a policy not to shake hands with women." If he's got a way of doing that, okay, great. But if he doesn't, there's a very strong side to say he should take her hand and not embarrass her. As long as he knows in himself that this is a completely non-sensual touch, and he's doing it completely to prevent any kind of embarrassment. Okay, I'm not passioning that one. Every situation is going to be different, but that just helps to put a more of an edge on how important it is to know what the level of isser is that can be involved. I've seen this happen where, like, a young immature yeshiva bocher, was introduced to somebody who didn't know. They stuck out their hand. A woman stuck out her hand at him, and he fell backwards over the couch. He got such a fright because he had just no idea what to do in the situation. Which was probably the worst thing he could have done under the circumstances. Yeah. So Right. This was all kind of a segue off. What do you do if you find that you've got this in your mouth, and can you swallow? Should you spit? And that all rides on whether bracha is a bracha levatala is d'oraisa or d'Rabbanan.
But you're right. At the end of the day, knowledge. A person has to know, like you're saying, what's a d'Rabbanan, what's a d'oraisa, what's a minhag, what's a chumrah, what's it applies in life. Right. We have that even just coming up now. It's going to come up Shemitah next year. That's also a lot of times, families. This one does this one does that. I remember I had one rabbi that told me, he said, listen, if you have a family member, they keep kosher's, you don't have to look in their pot, in certain things. Like in other words, you have to know, like you're saying, you have to know embarrassing somebody. There's a lot of comes up all the time.
And when he has another very good case. There was my Rosh Hashiva Zatzal, Rabbi Goldfein, was he was very cagey about this case. He didn't want to give too many details about who it was and what the halacha was, because he didn't want to get into the details of it. But he was traveling to somewhere to a community where he was visiting, and he had heard that they had a certain practice that the Rav of that shul had paskened was mutar, and he personally held that this was an Isser D'Oraisa. Yeah, I don't know what the situation was, where it was, or whatever. But he came back to tell us in the yeshiva, because it was a very important principle he wanted us to learn. He said he was going to that community, and they had a practice that they held was mutar, and he held was Aser Minatorah. So he called Rav Moshe Feinstein Zatzal in order to ask Shiloh, what do I do in this situation? And Rav Moshe said, I agree with you. I hold personally that this is an Isser min Torah, and that you definitely should not do this. But he says you're going into this Rav's domain. He's a legitimate Rav. He's a Talmid Chacham, and he holds differently. And when you go into his domain, you do what he does. You're in his city, and you have no right to act differently than him. So if he paskins it's mutar, then you have to do what he's. You certainly can't object. And if you're put in a situation where you have to show that you're where you have to do it, or like really stand out as not not following him, then you have to do what he paskin, and you're relying on his psak. It's that's a massive thing. This is another that leads me on to another tshuva of Rav Moshe Feinstein. He was asked a shaila about a certain kind of whiskey that had a small amount of brandy mixed in, and the brandy is made from grape liquor, and it wasn't a kosher brandy. And he went into the research, and he found two Rishonim who permitted it and one who asked it. And he said, based on this, it's probably okay. Based on this, the halacha is that it's okay, but a Baal Nefesh should rather refrain from it, because you can be choshesh for the minority opinion who says that it's aser. And he says, me personally, I don't drink that. But if I'm at a function and in public, and somebody offers me a l'chaim, then I will have a sip, just mishum yuhara, because it shouldn't come across that I'm being arrogant and that I hold myself above what everyone else is doing. So Rav Moshe Feinstein. Okay, that's the Godless of him. I mean, he's got the famous tshuva on chalav nochri, stam chalav, where he says that the fact that the government has such strong supervision over the dairies, and the penalties for violating, for mixing in anything non-kosher into the milk would be so severe that they would basically shut down the dairy. You can take that as basically as the same as a Jew is looking over it. because it's a no-brainer. There's not even a chance that the guy is going to mix in anything unkosher, and therefore you can treat stam government milk as basically as chalav Yisrael. And in that same tshuva, he says, but a Baal Nefesh, somebody who holds himself above, should it's a worthy chumrah for a Baal Nefesh to have milk that was literally supervised by a Jew. And that's how he paskins his tshuva on chalav akum. When his daughter Rebbetzin Tendler came to South Africa, Rabbi Goldfein's wife, the Rebbetzin should be well and strong. She said to Rebbetzin Tendler, "I've been dying to know, what milk did you drink in your house?" And she said, we got both. We got the regular milk and the chalav Yisrael, and Rav Moshe used to drink the chalav Yisrael, and everyone else had the regular milk.
Wow. That's godless. You know where he's holding, where his family, what to do. Well, didn't you give that example also? I don't know. I think I heard someone recently, maybe with Rafaro. You know Rafaro from here? From Ramat
Yes, the Chabad, the Rav
yeah.
Chabad, yes.
I think she told the Rebbetzin Faro, she gives some shiurams. I think my wife was in her shiur, and she said something like that, like maybe gebrochts or something on Pesach, like where her husband had a certain chumrah, but she and the rest of the house, like they didn't have that. same idea, same idea.
Right. Okay, so that's and that's an important thing. You mentioned Shemitah. I'm gonna segue into Shemitah because there's some important stuff to bear in mind with that. We're coming up on a Shemitah year now. Donna doesn't have all these worries.
Maybe she's making Aliyah. You never know. You're making Aliyah in the next couple of weeks, or
no plans there as far as we know. So anyway. Almost every din that we have in Shemitah is Derabanan. Because
I was in Israel once during the Shemitah year.
Oh yeah.
One of my trips.
Yeah, things get complicated, but it's we treat the Shemitah seriously, but in the absence of keeping the Yovel year, the din of Shemitah does not take hold in Min Torah. So there's a lot of leeway there, the fact that you're already starting on Isurim Derabanan. Okay, and obviously we keep the halacha midrabanan. And one of the biggest issues that you have in Israel is the concept of the heter mechira. Okay, what is the problem? What is the heter mechira? It's a harama. It's a trickery. It's a bit of trickery, which basically is that they sell a piece of land to the non-Jew, and they allow the non-Jew to farm that piece of land. He doesn't have the mitzvah of Shemitah, and his produce does not get affected by the kedusha of the Shemitah. Now there's some technical problems with that. Is that there's also an Isser Min Torah to sell land in Eretz Yisrael to a guy. So that's a little tricky, because they do it as a sale, as a temporary sale. So it's I think that's how they get around it. But there are people who say that I don't want to rely on that, and I don't think it's a trick. It's not a real sale, and does the sale of the land to the guy really mafkir its kedusha? And therefore, what you're seeing then is if the sale didn't really take effect, then what's going on is you've got trade happening in Shemitah produce, and you're not allowed to trade in Shemitah produce. It's supposed to be free, and anyone's supposed to be allowed to come and eat it, and therefore you've got a problem to go in and purchase this produce. You going in and purchasing this produce, which in reality is Shemitah produce, is an Isser. And okay, yeah, it's an Issa D'Rabbanan, but still it's an Issa D'Rabbanan. And you can't do that. However, there are many, very fine and upstanding rabbis who allowed Heter Mechira, who still paskin that Heter Mechira is allowed. And interestingly, I think when Rav Kook first came up with the idea, I think it was him who came up with the original Heter Mechira. It was really a pikuach nefesh situation because because it was in the early days of the Yishuv, before the Medina, and they needed some way to farm food. How are they going to farm the food? So they found this as a sort of a workaround. And I think when Rav Kook allowed it, he had in mind that it was going to be a once-off. So, okay, this year we will allow it. And then sort of just stuck. Say, hey, we did that 7 years ago. Let's do it again. And now it's just sort of become the standard way of circumventing keeping the Shemitah laws. So I think that's the general objection that the Haredi Welt has to the thing, is that it's just completely voided the concept of Shemitah, much like we've done with Prosbul. I mean, for Prosbul, you're supposed to at the end of the Shemitah, you're supposed to forgive all of your loans. So what happened is that Hillel saw that there was a problem going on in his time. We're talking in Hillel's time, where it's coming up end of the Shemitah, and the rich people don't want to lend money to the poor people because they see end of the Shemitah is coming. We're not going to get our money back. So he said, okay, it's worse that people aren't lending money. Let's at least find a way that they can lend money, even if they're going to claim it back after the Shemitah. He comes up with the mechanism of the Prosbul that permits it, and now it's practically a religious obligation nowadays to sign a Prosbul before Rosh Hashanah at the end of the Shemitah. It's not. I'm being facetious. It's not really an obligation. It's just a mechanism so that if you suddenly remember, oops, I had some money owing to me, then you can claim it again after the Shemitah. But yeah, you've got that situation again. So let's say you're somebody who doesn't hold by Heter Mechira, and you won't have any Heter Mechira produce in your house. And then you go to a friend who's kosher, who's Shomei Shabbos, Shomei Mitzvahs, completely Yarei Shemayim, but they do hold by Heter Mechira. They want to serve you food in their house. What are you going to do? You're going to tell them that we won't eat in their house? This is it's a tough question to say. On the one hand, you really don't hold that you don't hold by this Heter Mechira, and it's possible that the food that you're eating is completely aser, at least midrabanan. But it could be like that situation again, where if you find yourself in such a situation, maybe beforehand you can try and avoid situations where you're going to be put in that position. But once you're in the house and you suddenly realize, oops, these people are serving me Heter Mechira produce, probably the best thing to do under that situation is just to eat it, because there are legitimate opinions that Heter Mechira is kosher, and as opposed to the stink that you cause if you say, I'm sorry, I don't eat Heter Mechira. It's like, okay, how many Isurim did you violate at the moment that you say that to your host? So that's the thing. And if there's a real thing where that person is doing something wrong, you have to be azkan amer. You have to be bold like a leopard and say, I refuse to be over on any mitzvah. It can, if your mother or father tells you to violate Shabbos, you tell them, with respect, mom and dad, I don't break Shabbos. Okay, that's a clear din. Nobody's going to argue that. But when there's a machlokes aposkim, and when you've got somebody who is relying on a legitimate psak, it's very, very shaky ground to say, well, I don't hold like that, and I'm going to not eat what you're serving me. When you come into somebody else's house, they're the balabais. You don't look in their fridge. You don't ask what they're serving you. You take it and you eat it. You're trusting their kashrus because you know that they're somebody who keeps kosher. I mean, that's not an excuse to go into somebody's whose house who doesn't keep kosher. Obviously, that's not that's not legitimate. But when
I
it's
get-
somebody who, yeah.
But also, I guess also you have to know who, like what the family relationship is. Also know is like you're saying, if you come to somebody's house and that's the situation, that's one thing. But if let's say you have even your own parent, we've had this over the years, even with siblings or parents. If you could talk to them, living in Israel, or if you could talk to them in a nice way.
Oh yeah, totally. Like for example,
no, could work it out. Except for just I had one interesting, not with that, but let's say with let's say even hechsherim, here in Israel, it's there's
a lot of politics about hechsherim.
Yeah.
Yes.
I also used to have that, we'll call it young and stupid. This is the hechsher. We're sorry, but then as time goes on, as if I once had like my wife's parents, I realized that like they were spending more money, or let's say my father-in-law didn't really appreciate that he had to spend more money on a certain hechsher. He felt it was like stam chumrah. It was too and so then we realized like you can bend and you can be, you're not going to quote, I'm saying, like you said, you have to know but if you're coming to a family and they have that and it's kosher, so then you're right, you shouldn't, right?
Right, and as you pointed out, I was just going to say, like a couple of years ago, I went to stay with my brother in London. My brother's completely not from, doesn't keep kosher at home, but he wanted to host me, and he said, "Okay, what can we do to allow you to eat here?" So he opened up his kitchen and said, "Do what you need to, kasher what you need to, tovel what you need to," and so I went in and knowing what having this knowledge in my head was very useful. Knowing how to kasher things and knowing all of the dinim, what I needed to do, what I didn't necessarily need to do in order to cause the minimum upheaval possible.
Right.
And it was a very pleasant few days that I got to spend with him, and he was just like really very flexible about that. And when somebody knows that they don't keep kosher, it's a lot easier than when somebody thinks they keep kosher.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. All right. We got any more questions or any other things that we want to develop while we're on this theme, or should we spend 10 minutes talking about specifics in kashrus? Okay. So I think just with the remaining 10 minutes of the shir, we got the subject of Chaticha Naaseis Neveila. So remember, we were talking at the end of last week's shir about the Chanan part with the piece of meat sticking out and a drop of milk fell onto that piece of meat. So there's a very important principle in kashrus called Chaticha Naaseis Neveila. We've mentioned it before, or Chanan for short. If something is Chanan, it means basically that the kosher piece became treif. The whole thing became treif, not just the isur part of it. Now, there's a very big difference. I'm not going to dive into the text at the moment. I think it's with the remaining time that we have, I'm going to talk about this outside. There's a machlokes harishonim about whether we hold this din of Chanan just by basa b'chalav or also by other isurim. So let's see what's the practical. Take a practical example. Let's say you have a piece of kosher meat, and some other kind of isur fell onto this meat and got cooked into it. So let's take a piece of chaylev. Chaylev is a piece of prohibited fat. It's an isur min haTorah. Okay, and this piece of prohibited fat that got onto this meat, they got cooked together, and the taste got absorbed, and now this piece of meat is asur. Okay, so it's absorbed the taste of the chaylev, and now you can't eat it anymore. Okay. Now, what does it matter that this whole? Do we say that the Chaticha Naaseis Neveila, or just that there's isur balua, that there's an absorbed isur inside it? So just looking at this piece of meat, you can break it down into a sort of a philosophical discussion as to, does the meat intrinsically become asur, or is it just a technical thing that we can't eat it because there's isur absorbed inside it? Okay, what's the difference? The difference is, if that piece of meat subsequently falls into a Chanan pot. Okay, what shear do you need against that piece of, in the Chanan pot in order to neutralize the Isser? Do you need to go against just the chaylev that got absorbed into it, or do you need to go against the whole piece of meat? Okay, so if you say that there's no Chaticha Naaseis Neveila, that it's just a technical thing that you've got an Isser Balua, you've got an Isser absorbed inside that piece of meat, then you say, okay, it's all you have to do is have 60 in the Chanan pot against the original piece of chaylev, and then the whole thing is mutter. Okay, except possibly that piece of meat, but even then once you say that, you say, okay, so the piece of meat got cooked in and now it's absorbed into it fell into the Chanan. I didn't do it deliberately, and now it fell in, and now the taste of the chaylev has spread throughout the whole pot, and even the original piece of meat that was aser is now mutar, right? Because we managed to get everything out. That, by the way, is a principle called efshar lesochta mutar. If it's possible to squeeze it out, would it be possible to squeeze it out? You could say that this piece of meat is mutar again. Okay, which is basically two sides of the same coin with Chanan. If you say efshar lesochta mutar, then you say the piece is fine. Okay, but if you say Chaticha Naaseis Neveila, then you have then this whole piece of meat, however big that piece of meat is, that whole piece of meat has now become aser, and now when it falls into the Chanan pot, you need 60 against that piece of meat, not just about the chaylev. Okay, you with me so far?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the argument of Chanan by Shar Isurim, by other Isurim, not Basa B'chalav. When it comes to Basa B'chalav, everyone agrees that it's Chanan. You've created a new entity. If you had a piece of meat and it got cooked with a few drops of milk, enough that's more than 1 in 60. So now the piece of meat is completely aser. That piece of meat is now a new entity called Basa B'chalav. And everyone agrees that if that falls into a Chanan pot, you need 60 against the piece of meat. Right.
Yeah.
We all good with this. All right. So that's the idea of Chaticha Naaseis Neveila. There was another interesting principle that I wanted to say is like, okay, so when we have Isser in something dry, so let's say you have let's say you got chicken wings. I'm just going to take chicken wings because it's a small, and you wouldn't typically give chicken wings to, let's say, the Prime Minister or the Queen of England if she came to dinner. Maybe you'd have gourmet chicken wings somewhere in there, but in general, a chicken wing is there. But nivze, it's not the most chashuv a thing. So let's say you've got 2 kosher chicken wings lying on a plate. And a guy comes past carrying a bag of his own chicken wings, and one falls out and falls onto the plate, and now they're all mixed up, and you have no way of telling whether the chicken wings are kosher. There are 2 kosher ones and 1 treif. Okay, I think we might have dealt with this in a previous year, haven't we?
Sounds familiar.
Right. So the halacha is that all 3 of them may be eaten, because each one, as you take the first one, you can say, okay, so this probably came from the majority. And then the second one, you can also say, well, this also probably came from the majority. And when it comes to the third one, I say, well, I probably already ate the treif piece. And although there are various chumras around that, you shouldn't have one person eating all three of them. But that's all that. So in general, when we're talking about yavesh, when you're talking about dry things that haven't been cooked together, we go by a majority rule. But that doesn't apply when we've got a chaticha lehiskabed bo, something that's considered a chashuva thing. So let's take a steak. Okay, a nice entrecôte steak, something that you would serve in a restaurant. Something, it's a big, it's something that you would be honored to have on your plate. Okay. Now, if the same circumstance happens, and there were 100 kosher pieces and 1 non-kosher piece that fell in, Too bad. They're all asur. Why? Because each one, because they have importance, they have that intrinsic significance that every one of them is considered chashuv. So then the treif piece among there is always considered chashuv. It's always important. So you can never be mevatel it. Now, let me ask you this question. Let's say you had a piece of you have a steak, and that steak got cooked with chaylev. So now the steak is asur. Okay, so you have an asur steak, and now that fell back in the pile of all the kosher steaks. What's the din of that pile? Is it different from the case that I just mentioned, where you had, let's say, a treif steak, like a completely Neveila steak that fell in? So let's say we hold that Chaticha Naaseis Neveila. Even so, by the way, and we do hold that by Shari Surim. There's a machlokes between the Mechaber and the Ramah in that question of Chanan by Shari Surim. The Mechaber holds that there's no Chanan by Shari Surim, but the Ramah and all the other Ashkenazi poskim hold that yes, there is Chanan by all these other things. I don't recall if the Sfaradim lahalacha follow the Mechaber in this, or if it's also in another one of these cases where they're machmir like the Ramah. But let's say you're an Ashkenazi and you've got the situation where you had a kosher steak that was cooked with something like chaylev or dam or some blood, and it became asur, and then it became mixed up with all the other things. So the answer is that no, it's actually mutar. We have the din of bittul even barov. Why? Because the steak is not intrinsically asur. It's an isur balua inside it. So we said, okay, hold on, Chaticha Naaseis Neveila, but yeah, but so we're going to, because we have an opinion of Rabbeinu Ephraim and the Mechaber who say that this is mutar, and like you're talking about a situation where maybe this is like the suda for a wedding, and this is going to be a major financial loss. So we're going to be makel. If there's a hefsid merubah, if there's going to be a big loss over here because you've got these things mixed up, then we're going to permit it. But if it's basa b'chalav, no such thing. Once you have a piece of meat that was cooked with milk, it becomes intrinsically asur. It will never become mutar. It's not like there's an isur absorbed inside it. It is intrinsically asur, and if it gets mixed up with 1,000 other pieces of steak, too bad. There's no bittul for it, because it's got that chashivas. Anyway, that's sort of a summary of where the shir was going to go on tonight, but we intentionally used the opening half hour to do some Q&A and general rambling. So I hope you enjoyed that.
Yeah, very good.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure. All right, folks. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Yeah,
Will
take
do.
care.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.